It's Mr. Dorsey here, and for the first installment of going over some of your notes, um, the way that I would have in class, I'm going to try to keep these short. We'll see how they go. Hopefully, I'm going to have you react to these in Canvas and discussion boards soon. Um, the last thing that we talked about before remote learning ended was World War One. It was coming to a close. If you recall, the American side had joined the war. President Wilson had pushed us to do that in 1917. Russia has backed out of the war because they turned communist during the 1917 revolution. And at that point, what's going to happen is that Germany is weakening by that point as well. One of the big things I've been reading here lately is that one of the reasons that the war ended so quickly as it did was that you also had the 1918 Spanish flu that we talked about that was a pandemic, just like what we're going through now. And that caused both sides to want to quit the war as well. Either way, Germany gives up in November of 1918, which means now we're to the point where we need to talk about the end of the war. So on the screen there, you see Part 5, the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is a French word, and I'll get back to that, and its ramifications, which means basically just what the Treaty of Versailles did and what happened because of it. Versailles is a palace on the outside of. Sorry, got a place. Versailles is a palace on the outskirts of Paris, France. It's where many of the kings in France had lived, and the decision was made to meet and negotiate a treaty in the French city of Versailles. Now, if you guys look at the picture there, it's a big place. It's a fancy place. It had all sorts of amenities in it. So this is where, you know, almost 100 countries across the world will decide to meet. Now, here's a good look at the boardroom where they met. But what it really came down to is you had four big countries that were going to be involved in making decisions. Those four countries were Great Britain, which of course was, had the most success against Germany. France, which had endured most of the war and probably and their territory was invaded. You also have the Italians, who come in on the side of the Allies at the very end of the war. And finally, you have the United States. As you see on the picture there on the screen, it's called the Big Four Leaders. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Orlando from Italy, George Clemenza from France, and President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. It was actually a big deal for him to go over there and negotiate. Everyone thought that he would send his Secretary of State, but he wanted to do this himself. So these Big Four leaders come and they meet at the Treaty of Versailles, along with many other countries. But the United States, with Wilson, tries to set the tone. Wilson is going to bring with him a plan. All right. I think one of the things I joked about in class was that Wilson was a know-it-all, and this is one of the ways. He comes in with a 14-point plan, and if you look in your notes there, the PDF, I've got the 14 points laid out and exactly how he wrote them. They're a little hard to read, so therefore what I've done for you is I have also made them just a little more easier to digest. And so if you look at number 20, where it says the 14 points, I've kind of got them sectionalized here. You've got points 1 through 5, 6 through 13, and point 14 gets its own little special bullet point there. Points 1 through 5 were about getting rid of the main causes of the war, which he thought were: we needed free trade in the world, we needed to disarm, which means have not as big militaries. He wanted freedom of the seas. This was of course because the Germans were using submarines to sink ships. And he also wanted to make some changes on imperialism and colonial claims that all these nations like France, Britain, Germany had been taking. And then finally he said, let's have open diplomacy instead of secret agreements like those allies that like those alliances that we talked about before the war. And finally, if you look to 613, he also wanted smaller nations to be able to use democracy themselves and form. The most important point becomes point 14. Wilson wanted to create an international body called the League of Nations. That way that nations could come together and talk things out instead of going into a massive war like World War One. Well, what happens is at the Treaty of Versailles, the European nations, specifically France and Great Britain, were not going to hear this. Number one, they said there's nothing in there about Germany getting punished. All right, that's going to be a big part of this. They wanted Germany to be punished. Secondly, um, they add to it a number of clauses to punish Germany. And if you look at the board there, or on the board, excuse me, look at the slide there, they have a section called the War Guilt Clause. Germany must take full blame for the war itself. They said, Germany, you have to fully disarm, and we're not going to, which means you're not going to have a military, or at least a full military. And finally, or excuse me, not finally, Germany was forced to give up land. And by the way, that was especially hard for the German military because they were winning the war. They were in France when the war ended. And now the Germans are giving up land. And lastly, the Germans, and this ends up being a big part of this, the Germans had to pay back reparations or damages because of what happened in the war. No other countries were required to do that. By the way, if for later on, and we will get to this point eventually, Adolf Hitler, of course, this is going to be one of his main gripes to start up World War II and to rise in power. He's saying that the Germans are having to take blame, they can't have a military, etc. He uses the Treaty of Versailles as a backdrop for his famous book that he wrote, Mein Kampf. Now, something I do want to talk about as well is that the Treaty of Versailles is also going to change world maps, and I should have included a map in there. The Russian Empire is no more because of the Russian Communist Revolution. The Ottoman Empire, which was main day Turkey, which is hundreds of years old, is now broken up. And the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is now broken up. And you also have the creation of a number of new countries that weren't around before because they were part of these empires. You have Yugoslavia being formed, Poland being formed, Czechoslovakia, nations that we recognize today, or at least have heard of today, that were broken away. On the bottom there, if you see, Wilson's only big win, all right, is the other European nations, France and Britain mainly, agree to the 14th point. They agreed to the League of Nations, all right? And so he's very happy about this. Now, what's going to happen is that Wilson is going to go on a speaking tour to push this Treaty of Versailles because the United States Senate, just for lack of a better way of saying it, they do not like it. They felt like that, number one, many of these people in the Senate thought that the war was a bad idea to begin with. It didn't solve anything. They thought that if we got involved in the League of Nations, that would actually get us into more problems on the international landscape, that we'd always be involved in little small wars and things like that. So the U.S. does not join the League of Nations. Now, Wilson is going to go on a speaking tour, as I said, to fight that and actually try to get the American public behind the idea of joining the League of Nations. But in that trip, on that tour, he has a stroke, and he serves out the remainder of his presidency bedridden, probably unconscious. I put a slide on there for you. It shows Wilson and his wife. His wife ends up being mainly his big helper. It is joked oftentimes that she is the first female president because she signs a lot of his papers for him. She does a lot of his day-to-day work for him. But the main thing that I want you to get out of this is that Wilson, because of his health state, does not get the U.S. to join the League of Nations. And so that leaves us in 1819, or excuse me, leaves us in 1819, not joining the League of Nations, and that puts us in the 1920s after this war ends. And we will pick up that with topic 20. Thank you.